So we got you back. So did you have anything else than your normal preaching? Were you listening to anything I was reading?
I woke up not that long ago, but I played back some of the earlier stuff, and the most interesting thing that you said was, well, when you stated the problem of evil, and is that really what you think is the main problem of people believing in God? The problem of evil.
Well, I was saying the colloquial understanding of truth in Judaism is the expression "Bruk dein emes," blessed is the true judge when something bad happens. So the most common thing when in Judaism, where we use the word truth, is in response to tragedy. That like God forbid, if someone dies or has a horrible accident, the proper response is "Blessed is the true judge." So I meant
Yes, because you
that
are supposed to
understanding of
thank
truth
God.
is relation to the problem of evil, in the sense that God is the true judge, and what appears to be evil is not actually evil, because the real truth is, from the God's eye perspective, and is beyond our understanding. So what appears to be evil or bad to us is not really bad. And that's the most common sense of the use of the word truth in Judaism, is in relation to the real understanding of the problem of evil, that really there is no evil or bad. Yeah, as
Yes,
opposed
so
to the scientific or empirical modern day of like corresponding to reality. I mean, you could
well, there was
interpret corresponding to
Shakespeare.
reality, but corresponding to empirical reality.
Well, this I don't know if you know that Shakespeare said, or Shakespeare said through Hamlet, that there is no good or evil, only thinking makes it so. Are you familiar with that saying?
Yeah, I think I've heard that. I mean, even that's like mind independence. That good and evil is a category of mind, as like E. Michael Jones would say it. Even something that
Well, we impose meaning on it by our feelings, our subjective feelings. What is evil to you might not appear to be evil to me, but there's more than one definition of evil, isn't there? That there's what's called natural evil and moral evil, and natural evil is pestilence, natural disaster, um, that kind of thing. That happens. I suppose people would say natural causes, and then there is the suffering caused by moral evil, which is people being mean to you. But anyway, the whole idea is that God created evil, which is I think what 1915 of Isaiah. God created good and evil.
yeah, there might be a few
Um,
verses like that put it that way.
so um, I mean, I thought people had understood what it all meant by saying these things are sent to try us, and it's not what happens. It's not what happens to us, but how we deal with it that determines our fitness to go to heaven or hell. And that is the purpose of evil, to test us for our fitness to go to the good place or the bad place.
Yeah, and that's the sense of truth that, like, what I put in the terms the epicure and trilemma, that God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing. And although things might appear to be evil, that the truth is theologically referring to this thing that we can't understand, that explains away our misperceptions of the problem of evil.
Yes, it's the idea that our opinion doesn't matter. This is a point that you've emphasized time and time again, that what we think about it is in fact insignificant, and particularly so if we're wrong. And why do we expect to be right? Because we don't know, well, the purpose behind God's doings. I mean, it's the story of Job, isn't it? He didn't know, but he accepted his suffering, And because he accepted his suffering and he didn't curse God as his wife was telling him to do, he was eventually restored. And I suppose if you wanted to make sense of the suffering, it was to teach others a lesson about why we must bear our suffering with fortitude rather than curse God and die, as Mrs. Job said to him to do.
Yeah, so this is one of the precipice for the multiple truth hypothesis, because here truth is purely being defined on a theological, metaphysical terms that can't be subjected to empiricism, as opposed to modern science, somewhat philosophy, where truth is purely dependent on empiricism and verification. So, what does the word truth mean? If we're, as a believer, saying there's an ultimate truth that is beyond our knowledge and empiricism and is theological in basis versus our scientific understanding of what truth is. And
Well,
then,
well,
in some of the
there's no way of proving God exists, but we either choose to make the inference or we don't. So I suppose the problem for Jews is that you're supposed to believe in God. So how do you explain evil? And the answer must be that suffering has meaning, and even if we don't know the meaning of the suffering, um, eventually we will know. And you mentioned earlier the problem of evil for Jews, in terms um, of the Holocaust. But that is also explained by certain rabbis, such as Rabbi Miller, who said um, Jews were punished with the Holocaust because they assimilated. I know this is not a popular view, but he did indeed say this, didn't he?
it's the mainstream,
Avigdor Miller.
right, with Victor Miller. I mean, it's the mainstream Haredi Orthodox opinion. I mean, it's imperative because of I mean, like Job, but like they're saying, like, well, there was suffering. God is all powerful, all good, and all knowing. That, so to say, God allowed the suffering, or even to say
To teach
God
us a lesson.
caused the suffering. That must have been what's best for us. That must, say, okay, well, why am I suffering? My suffering is a form of God's compassion. And even, if you want to look like the worst possible suffering, the unfortunate death, torture of innocent children, women, um, that you say, well, how is that God's compassion? And you would say that's like a contradiction. God is all knowing, all good, and all powerful, but yet we see, the Holocaust. And but
Well,
theologically,
that is yes. So the only way that we can make sense of it is to assume that it's not what happens to you that is the that matters. It is how you deal with it, and I suppose the idea is that we've been given rules about how to behave and how to deal with people being mean to you, and how to um, be remain cheerful, and if we believe in the afterlife.
well, I mean,
Is it?
the theology is extremely simple from the aspect of punishment for sin is kindness from God. That so okay, well, suffering is caused as punishment. So it's that, well, someone's suffering, they're suffering because of punishment for sin, and
Or
from
they
the
need to
God,
be taught a lesson, and the
yeah,
lesson will be ultimately good for humanity.
and so you could see from, like, the blessed is the true judge, that punishment for sin is actually a kindness. And so in the middle of my suffering, in the middle of my punishment, I will cry out in pain, and it'll be hard for me to accept that it's what's best for me. However, from the ultimate perspective, the ultimate truth, punishment for sin is a kindness, not an evil. So say that, well, what is evil? Evil, from the Kabbalist will say, it's an opportunity, as a proving ground to test us so that we could earn our reward, or it's related to the giving of free will and punishment for sin. And
Yes, so if we bear our suffering with fortitude and grace, we will be rewarded with heaven. But if we respond to our punishment by punishing others, taking it out on others, then we go to the worst place. I think, that's the idea. Um, as well as the idea of
the
no,
Judaic view is more forgiving than that. That's more the Christianity with the eternal damnation. Most of the Jewish Kabbalists hold that but at least all Jews, but in some of them even all creation, basically make it through. So there's punishment, purgatory, and it's not eternal. So it's not necessarily a matter of like bearing your suffering with grace to say that it's proportional, but but this is just what the Kabbalists say because the belief that God is all kind, all loving, all good, that we're going to have some punishment, and it could be worse for people who did more sin and bad activities than others. But in the end, we're all going to make it through, and we're all going to get the reward.
yes, in this life or the next. So if it appears that our
Well, the
suffering is
ultimate reward will be
disproportionate in this life,
no, the
it will
ultimate
be
reward
made
will
up
be in the next
later.
life. I mean, you can have
Hmm?
reward in this life. They're saying you'll be rewarded in this life and the next, but the ultimate reward will not be in this life.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, the bargain is already clear. It's just that people are looking for an excuse, but um, this argument that because evil exists, God cannot also exist. But the bargain was never that this life is a bed of roses. He never said nothing would ever go wrong.
But you can't necessarily establish. I say there's that suffering exists. Most people, because suffering is still a product of mind. But I mean, you could reasonably convince most people, besides the extreme skeptics, that suffering exists. However, evil is unclear, and then if you define evil as unjust suffering, so you're saying, like, well, suffering exists, and then what's the difference between evil and suffering? That evil is unjust suffering, as opposed
Or
to
evil is unnecessary suffering inflicted on
yeah,
another.
unnecessary or
And then
unjust.
that would be moral evil.
So what from the theological perspective, the Judaism is saying evil doesn't exist in the sense that there is no unnecessary or unjust suffering. And so you see, like, okay, certainly there's suffering, like, I mean, although I was saying you still could argue that the suffering is like a false category of mind or doesn't really exist. But, taking that minor argument out of the picture, um, it's much more difficult to instantiate that evil actually exists. Because if you're saying that evil is unjustified or unnecessary suffering, how could you
Of
how could
evil.
you conclusively demonstrate that there's such a thing as unnecessary or unjustified suffering? If you say, like, well, you're like a baby, innocent people
Well, if
or
I kill
something.
babies for fun, I mean, nobody's going to deny that I'm evil.
Well, no, because
Will they?
you have to
Because it's not
substantiate
necessary
that
that
there's
I
such
go
a
around
thing as
killing
innocence.
babies for fun, but it might be justified if I am defending myself against
Well, so I
being
mean, so
killed. I mean,
theologically,
self-defense is a complete defense to murder.
I mean, you understand what the progression I'm making here. So I mean, Judaism is going to say theologically evil does not actually exist. Suffering exists. However, unjustified suffering doesn't exist. We just don't understand why it's justified. But in the end of the day, like, if God's allowing the suffering to happen, God is just, God is all good and all loving. If there's suffering, it's we believe it's justified. That therefore evil doesn't exist, and that that's why people tend to become atheists because they think that the God there can't be a God who's all knowing, all powerful, all good, all loving because there's evil, and they don't really know that there's evil. What they know is that there's suffering, and then they make the conjecture that there's unjust suffering. They say, because they have to say, well, what is innocent? They say, well, like this person's innocent and they're still suffering, therefore there's evil and there can't be a God. However, how do you demonstrate that there's such a thing as innocence? How do you demonstrate that suffering, that there's undeserved suffering?
Because well, in the case of Job, he didn't do anything wrong, but he suffered because God used him to make a point, didn't he? Didn't God?
Well,
That was
that's
the
what
whole
we have
point of the
from the
story
book.
of Job.
No, but I mean, Job did do something wrong. He was a fence sitter.
Sorry,
Well, I'm saying that, I mean, Job did do, he was a fence sitter.
what did what do you mean?
The verse, it said that Job was a fence sitter,
I don't understand. What does that even mean?
that Job was not fully on God's side. He was tested because he was a fence sitter.
Okay,
Fence sitting is when
what
you're
did he do
sitting
that
on the
made him a
fence.
fence sitter?
You know what fence sitting is, right?
Not making up your mind. You know, like saying, "Oh, um, the election wasn't stolen," or "I don't know," or I wouldn't like to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms
That's
of
fence
belief,
sitting, isn't
I
it?
mean, like agnosticism is fence sitting,
Yes.
right? Like
Um,
agnosticism is like
yes, you could say that. But when you refuse to make up your mind, like something happened, but you refuse to say it's evil because you don't want to offend, some greater power. I mean, there is a difference between really having no opinion or having an opinion and refusing to state it in order not to offend a greater power who might victimize you. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, did Job actually do something that suggested he was fence sitting?
well, I read the verse. I mean, it comes from the rabbinic commentary, but just the first. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. The man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Um, so the commentaries say that he refrained from sinning and he feared God, but he didn't love God. He was on the fence in the sense that he recognized that there was evil and sin and refrained from sin, but he wasn't actively a servant of God. And he was blessed. It was easy for him because he had a good life. So that's what the Satan said. Um, then
But he proved himself, didn't he, in the end? Because it's easy to believe in God if you keep getting
well,
what
he
you want.
stood
But
by
if you
God
didn't
when
get what you want, you would start to curse God, wouldn't you? I mean, most people would readily admit that
that's the
if all
verse
they
9. I mean, that's the key thing in Job, like verse 8. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is no one on earth like him? He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And then verse 9, does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flock and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. So to say that Job was free of sin, but he wasn't like he was, I forget where the fence sitter, if the rabbi uses the expression fence sitter, but you say that he wasn't a servant of God. He was just someone who abstained from sin and was blameless, but he wasn't actively a good person. He just refrained from doing bad, but he didn't do good. And then to
yeah,
say
but by
it was
any
easy, it was
standard,
easy for him because he had been blessed. He was, he took high birth, he was wealthy, everything was going good for him. So in that sense,
yes,
but
yes,
to say that,
and it was upping the ante. God didn't curse. Sorry, Job didn't curse God, even though his children died and he lost his property, and then then his body was afflicted with blisters and boils, right? It, his suffering increased, even though he didn't curse God, because the devil and God were m- had put this bet on. So the devil said, well, if he started, if his own body was afflicted, he would curse you, and and God said, all right, I don't think he will, and he afflicted Job with boils and blisters, and God still,
Yeah, so the
sorry,
rabbinic
Job
commentaries
still
make
didn't
the
curse
point
God.
that Job was not necessarily a good person. He was just a
Okay,
person.
you
He was
can't
just a
prove that
person
he's
who
a
he
bad
was a
person,
person who
or that he
abstained
wasn't
from
good
being a
enough,
bad
because by
person.
any standards, people would think Job didn't do anything wrong, and it was wrong of God to punish Job for no good reason. But the point is that make God was showing people that, well, eventually, you know, the end of the story was that Job was restored. So everything was okay. And maybe Job would think, "Oh, all right, since I was restored and since I'm now famous forever, being in the book of Job, and everybody will hear of my my suffering and how I bore it with fortitude and never once lost faith in God. This is the lesson I was. That was the purpose of my suffering, to teach others a lesson, even if I myself did not need the lesson, because I stayed true to God. So that was the purpose of the suffering of Job, to teach all the rest of us, the lesson that we are to bear our suffering with fortitude.
Yeah, I mean, that's a basic lesson. But I mean, just saying that was Job's suffering on on justified. I mean, you're saying it's evil because it was undeserved suffering.
No, what I'm trying to say is that it can be made good even to the sufferer himself. So Job
Even if he
at the
gets
time,
rewarded bigger in the future for it, but to say that
what?
there's two separate distinctions. So you say, okay, granted, he gets rewarded in the future for enduring his suffering. However, if he didn't do anything to warrant his suffering, that's like a form of evil because it's that that okay, you that justify in the sense that he gets a future bigger reward for enduring the suffering. However, he didn't do anything to deserve the suffering, and therefore that's like undeserved suffering. That was like a case of evil. And so if you're making the claim that there is no such thing as undeserved suffering, by definition, that
Well, if we can just assume that suffering is meant to either punish evil people or teach humanity a lesson. So Job's suffering
well, I mean, teach
um,
Job a lesson.
falls
Job himself was
into
taught a
the
lesson.
the second category.
Well, I mean, Job was forced off the fence in the sense that Job feared God and refrained from sin, but he didn't actively love God. He wasn't
Yes,
actively.
I know. Okay, then let me put it another way.
So it wasn't just to teach us; it was also Job himself needed to be taught a lesson that fearing
No,
God
no, not
and abstaining
necessarily,
from sin is not enough.
because Job
Job
would
needed
have
to
been
be forced off
happy.
the fence.
Okay, if I could just make my point, which is that if you asked Job later, like, yes, you suffered and you thought you didn't do anything wrong, and it's true you didn't do anything wrong, but the purpose of our suffering, Job, is to teach humanity a lesson. And I'm sure, says God to Job, that you would be happy to be the object of this lesson. You would, because you were eventually restored, and probably was,
Well, that could be,
things.
but I'm
He
saying
was
just
rewarded in
just to
heaven.
teach Job himself a lesson. They're saying no,
Okay, so I'm saying
even
if I
without
were
like his
Job and I
lesson being internalized as a lesson for all of humanity after him, But say even without that, just to teach Job
Yeah,
himself
but
a
we're talking
lesson.
about the whole point, the end of the story. So obviously, at the time when he was suffering, he was asking all sorts of questions. But eventually, he worked out that the purpose of his suffering was to teach humanity a lesson. And Job, being a good man, would have been satisfied with this reason.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're inaccurate. The purpose was to teach Job a lesson, not
Well,
necessarily.
how do
I
you
mean,
know? How do you know? I mean, I'm saying it was to teach humanity a lesson, and Job has eternal fame, and that should be reward enough.
no, because you're saying that the suffering would have been valuable in and of itself if no one ever knew the story, just for the lesson that Job himself learned from it, even if humanity never heard the story, that Job himself, the lesson that he learned from it was worth the suffering in and of itself.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. That 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 when he realized that it wasn't necessarily um him being punished for doing evil things, it was he was an object of a lesson to so that humanity would learn that they too must bear
Yeah,
their
but you're still
suffering
stuck
with
on this, like,
fortitude,
so that
like
humanity would
Job.
learn.
What?
You're still stuck on this, like, so
No,
humanity
I'm
would
not
learn.
stuck. I'm making my point, and you refuse to accept it. I say Job would be happy to have suffered in order to teach humanity a lesson to serve God's purpose because he was a good man.
Yeah, that might be, but I'm saying that even without that, the Job would have been worth the suffering just for the lesson he himself learned.
Okay, but that's not in the book of Job, is it?
Well,
I, I mean,
what you're
I
saying
mean,
is
it
not
said
the book of
that he
Job.
was
No,
restored, and that
what I'm
was
saying
that
is
was
a
the
simple
happy
reading of the
ending.
book of Job. What you're saying is like is there a statement in Job that says, "And this will be an eternal lesson for all of humanity to learn from"?
Well, we can infer it, can't we?
Yeah, but I'm saying what I'm saying is in the book of Job. What you're saying is not in the book of Job. I mean,
Well, I'm saying
at
it
the
can be
end,
inferred
Job
that
doesn't
was the
say
purpose of his
Job doesn't
suffering.
say I didn't really deserve this suffering, but because I'm going to
He did.
be
He did at the beginning. Like, why, why,
because I'm going
why,
to be this
why?
memorable um, lesson for the rest of humanity to learn from, I'll take it. Job recognized that he was wrong for being a fence sitter, and the suffering was justified because of his fault of sitting on the fence.
Well, did he say that? Did he actually say he knew he was a fence sitter? Which verse was this?
I mean, you have the book of Job open in front of you.
No, I don't. But I don't remember the expression fence sitter. But isn't it enough? I mean, you want more reasons? I mean, even if Job didn't do anything to deserve it. I mean, there's this idea that we'll all be tested by God, right? That's the whole point of the bargain. And because he was such a good man, his test would have to be harder. Just because he just passed all the easy ones of being kind and a good neighbor and a generous host and all the rest of it. So because he was already such um, a good man, his test would be harder than all the test of ordinary men.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Job, the last chapter, 42, Job 42:6. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job admits that he had been wrong.
To question God
Yes, I mean, Job
because he would say, "Why,
suffering,
oh
it
why,
wasn't
oh
that
why?"
he suffering for, I mean, God forbid, his questioning of God legitimated his suffering.
No, well, I mean, he was meant to suffer anyway, but in the end, he accepted that he accepted his punishment. He didn't say, he didn't curse God and die as his wife told him to, because he saw the good of his suffering, not necessarily for himself, but in a way he was rewarded by eternal fame, and this, um, the only example of suffering with fortitude. Well, I can't think of any others. So Job is synonymous with suffering with fortitude, isn't he? There's no other biblical character that you know who suffered as much for so little reason.
Yeah, but say even Job did not suffer unjustly in the sense of evil. And
Yes,
even
yes. Well, I would agree with you there because uh, um, there was meaning to his suffering. It wasn't, just random punishment, and God moved on. Because if you are prepared to look for it, there is um. Well, if you believe in the afterlife, then you would think, well, Job must have gone to the better place.
I'm saying it wasn't just meaning for the lesson for future people, it's the meaning for Job himself that repents, that didn't understand something, and then after his suffering, understand things, that didn't love God, that he feared God and he abstained from sin, but he didn't love God and he didn't believe and trust in God at a proper level, and he questioned God, and like God
Um,
forbid is suffering for questioning God.
well, he didn't question the existence of God, and he didn't even
He didn't question. He
question.
didn't become an atheist, but he questioned God.
Yes, but well, Jews are meant to wrestle with God, aren't they?
Um, well, like Abraham, for others, not for yourself. So when Job was suffering, so you're supposed to wrestle with God over the suffering of other people, not over the suffering of yourself. So if I'm suffering, I say certainly I deserve my own suffering. I myself know my own sins and bad activity. So if I'm suffering, I'm not going to question God and say, like, please don't make me suffer. But I'm not going to question God that I don't deserve my suffering because I know my own
Mm.
sinful activity. You could wrestle with God for other people, not for yourself. That's the lesson of Abraham. There's many. Abraham wrestles with God for the suffering of other people, not for his own. When God talks about suffering that Abraham will endure, he never speaks up or argues with God on his own behalf. He accepts that he deserves it.
Yes, Abraham argued. Well, he tried to defend even the
But
even
Abraham argued on behalf of other people, not himself.
yes, Sodom and
Job,
Gomorrah.
Job argued on behalf of himself, not other people.
Well, because Job was the one who was suffering, but Abraham said, "Oh, don't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. There might be some good people in it." And
Yeah, I mean to
but
say
but
that
anyway,
if Abraham was suffering, he'd be like, I am sinful and I deserve my suffering, as opposed to Job, who suffered and said, what did I do to deserve this? As
well,
opposed to
I
Job
think everybody can
and
can imagine
recognizing
themselves arguing the
recognizing that
question.
he did do something to deserve it, as opposed to saying, oh God, why are you doing this to me? What did I do to deserve it? So Abraham did not argue with God on behalf of his own suffering. He argued with God on behalf of the suffering of other people. And that's the
Yes, I
essential. So
understand.
I mean, like, God forbid, that's like the fighting anti-Semitic, and the point I'm making, that okay, like, like, we're not all supposed to be all caught up with like, selfishness. But like the Abraham, accept my own suffering, and then argue and fight for the suffering of other people, not myself.
Yes, but the
It's
Abraham,
like the Jesus
or
principle. I mean, it's the essential Jesus principle. I mean,
well, I
the
don't think
Jesus
Jews
principle can.
are supposed to accept that Jesus suffered unjustly, because if he did say his papa was God, then he was guilty of blasphemy, and blasphemy
Well, I was saying the
attracts
Jesus
a penalty
principle
of
of
death.
accepting the suffering of other people upon himself. So I mean, it's really the essential Judaic principle of the prophets in general. But I'm saying Jesus personifies the acceptance of other people's suffering on yourself. So if I'm suffering, I deserve it. I know I'm sinful. I know all the bad things I do. I don't need you to tell me what a bad person I am. If I'm suffering, I know I deserve it. However, other people, if they're suffering, I don't know that they deserve it, and therefore I could speak up on their own behalf. So I would be a fool if I were to speak up on my own behalf.
Well,
And
you
that
would if you were suffering. You'd be asking why. Stop it. I'm going to be good from now on, and
no, I
whatever,
suffer all the time.
as you
I
would
don't.
be expected to
Well, yeah,
do.
I would say I wouldn't say what did I do wrong. I know what I did wrong. I might talk to God and argue with God, like I'm trying hard, like cut me a break here or something like that. But I'm not going to be like I don't deserve it. I'm not going to like what did I do wrong? Like I know what I did wrong. I mean, God forbid you know what you did. Like I mean, God forbid, you know the classic counter Semite. Even in the Holocaust, I've heard it from multiple people. But if you ever heard that, like what you did, but
Oh yeah, parents say that.
yeah, and saying like what you did. I know what I did. If I'm suffering, like I know what I did. I'm not going to tell God that like oh what did I do? Like I know what I did, and I might say like okay like I'm trying hard or like I do a lot of good things. Cut me a break or like I promise I'm going to do better or something like that. But I'm not going to pretend like I didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, but
I mean,
but
even
but
you're going to come in like you're
the
Hinduism, you're
problem
this,
of
you're that. Like
suffering is
I'm
not.
trying. I mean, I'm not even gonna say I'm trying my hardest. Like I'm trying. I'm trying. Like it's tough. It's a tough world out here. I'm trying to do my best, and I'm failing. And if I'm hitting suffering and punishment, I see like I know I'm failing. But I could beg for mercy from God and be like, oh, I'm gonna cut me a break. But like Job in the sense to be like, well, what did I do wrong? Like I don't deserve this, and that's what Job repents for at the end.
For questioning God. Yeah, yeah, and the purpose of God could, I mean, it's arguably benign that we are to put up with our suffering with
Of
fortitude and
course, it's
not.
benign. So I mean, that's the
Yeah,
point of Job. Like if you're suffering, they say God's intention is, of course, it's benign, and that say like, oh, like God forbid if you're taking like an atonement or purgatory. Like I know all the bad things I've done, and like God forbid the suffering that I might go. Like eventually, my body will become food for maggots and worms,
yes.
and then
So the
and then to say like,
idea that we are to put up with our suffering with fortitude is the lesson, is the moral to be extracted from the story of Job.
well, you mean you're just saying to put up with fortitude, and it's not put up, but it's saying to the higher level to say that our suffering is actually a kindness from God.
Yes, because it's meant to teach us something important.
Well, there's multiple
And
levels.
obviously,
It's
all
meant,
these
it's meant to
people who
purify.
seem to be saying that because evil exists, God doesn't, are people who don't get it.
But you're saying a weaker version, where you say that it's meant to purify us from our own sins. That like I'm not just like being strengthened by suffering. Like no, I messed up, and when I suffer, it's a purification from my past bad behavior.
Yes, yes. So it's like you you paid for your sins, and you've got a clean slate again. Yes, I mean it's like incurring a debt and paying it off, and the books balance again. That sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's saying it's a mercy of God to give us a method to purify ourselves for our past iniquities. And so without
Yes.
suffering, some of you looking like you like. I mean, you could look okay. I mean, like Adam Green might put the question like, well, couldn't God have created the world in some way that we didn't have to suffer as the payment for our past iniquities? God is all powerful. Couldn't God create a system that doesn't necessitate suffering?
No, because that's the whole bargain, Eda. If you want eternal life, we have to regard this life as an examination hall.
Well, I'm saying like this is like Adam Green's main argument for his agnosticism, and it's pretty common. In he was saying that if God is all powerful, why did God need this suffering system? So I can say, okay, like suffering is logical, but and I could see like, okay, like yeah, I've messed up in purification or whatever. I mean, I could understand suffering, but saying, well, God's all powerful, couldn't he have created a system that didn't necessitate suffering? Couldn't God have
No,
like done all this, kindness and goodness and free will or all this other thing that
because
didn't?
what you're saying,
And
if
so
we
you're
don't
saying
suffer,
like,
it
like
means we're already in heaven, right? If life on earth has no suffering, then we're already in heaven.
yeah, but you're
But do we
restricting God's
deserve to
power.
be? No.
You're saying that like God has a limitation that the system had to be this way, that there wasn't a way to create the world that didn't involve suffering.
Yes, because it's all
Is that
about
because
Leibniz and his idea of living in the best of all possible worlds.
but you're limiting God's power by saying that God couldn't have created a world that had all these benefits without necessitating suffering.
Well, because what you just described is heaven. If we lived and everything was fine and nothing bad ever happened, we would already be in heaven. But there is no between us and God in saying, you're entitled to live in heaven just by virtue of being born. That was never the bargain. The bargain was obey God's laws and get to heaven. In the meantime, you will
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're
to
saying.
suffer and bad things will
I'm
happen to
just,
you
I'm
and
just
you will
giving
be expected, knowing what the laws are, to obey them.
the theological question is why couldn't have God created the system without suffering?
Because because if he did create such a system, we would already be in heaven, wouldn't we?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you're saying heaven is defined by not suffering, and there still could have been tests or free will without suffering. And you're saying God is all powerful. If you're
Well, he never
limiting,
promised us a bed of roses. That's my whole point. I mean, it was never the bargain. I mean, the only reason why he made his laws is to say you have to obey them and try and be happy within these constrictions. And if you obey them, you'll get to heaven. But if you don't, you go to hell. That's the bargain.
I'm saying that we're in this situation. So we say that's the situation we're in. But I
Yes,
mean, from the theoretical perspective, it's saying, well, why did God create it this way? And
to give us
theoretically, you're trying to
the
understand
opportunity
why
of
couldn't God have created the system
exercising our free
without
will,
suffering?
because the suffering is necessary for us to
Yeah, I
choose
mean,
carefully.
you're saying the same thing over and over again, and saying
And
that
so are you.
well, because you're not giving a logical
You're not
explanation.
taking my
You're
point.
not.
You're
I am
actually
taking your point.
refusing to take my
You're not
point.
saying like just from why couldn't God created the system without suffering?
Because then it would be heaven.
Well, okay, so like good, then we would have been heaven. Like so,
Yeah, but the whole idea is that we are to be tested in this life for our fitness to go to heaven or hell. So we haven't completed the process
yeah,
in
but
order to.
you're creating rules that limit God's power. So you're saying
No,
there's
it's not because God already
yes, you're
intended
saying that
this sort of thing.
there's these some sort of principles that limits God's ability to have done things, and therefore
No, well,
God
obviously
had
he
to
would
have
have
done.
done that if he chose to, but obviously he didn't, and the reason is obvious, isn't it? That that the whole purpose of the bargain is to test us in this life, so so we get eternal life. If that is indeed what happens, and even if it doesn't happen, even if it's all a story, the purpose of the story is to keep people behaving as well as they can be according to the laws. And we know what happens when open atheism is general, which it is now. People become, well, nihilists. They cheat, they lie, they kill. because they think they'll get away with it because they're powerful.
I mean, Reiner in the chat is saying something like suffering is a mercy act of God. Pretty sadistic, ain't it? It was that like, well, no, I mean, that's what Judaism is saying, like truth. Remember the last time we were talking, I was telling you about the correspondence theory of truth.
I'm not sure what it is.
I mean,
The
truth.
correspondence
The
theory of truth.
correspondence theory of truth means truth. The truth is true because it corresponds to reality, and usually that's referring to scientific and physical laws. Like a scientific theory is true if it corresponds to you observe reality, physical testing, empiricism. But even from a Judaic perspective, saying ultimate reality, and ultimate reality includes the soul surviving death, heaven and hell, God and creation. So you're saying the ultimate reality, truth is yes, suffering is a mercy act of God. And so if you're looking at it from the man's eye perspective, you say, well, that sounds pretty sadistic. That, but you're saying that the ultimate truth is yeah, but yes, that suffering is a mercy act of God. However, from the man's eye perspective, then it was always the questionable, like God, couldn't you made it? Couldn't like why the suffering? Like, okay, I understand messing up.
Don't question me. God would say, don't fucking question me.
Well, yeah, I'm
You
saying
don't
that
know anything. I mean,
I'd
you
be a
can't
fool
even
to
you
question God.
understand the simple.
I'd be a fool
Okay,
to question God, but I'm saying just from my perspective that I don't like to suffer, and I'm supposed to believe that suffering is an act of mercy. And they're saying like this God that loves me and is all powerful, did he really not have the ability to
okay,
create a system that didn't
okay.
involve suffering?
Well, put it this way: imagine, if you didn't feel pain, if you didn't feel physical pain. I mean, I know that some people don't because of some medical condition or whatever. I mean, you already know the danger of this, don't you? If you don't feel pain, physical pain,
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd be more
you
likely
would.
to injure myself. That pain is a
Yes,
protective measure.
exactly. So that is the point of suffering. Don't do these things. And if you do, you're going to get hurt. And the pain is supposed to tell you something, not to do it.
Yeah, but it's saying that I mean I understand that. It is saying that, but pain still hurts, and
Yes, if it didn't hurt, you
and
keep
just saying
doing
that
it until
this
you
all
died,
powerful
right?
God, it just wonder like I'm not God, but it's saying if I was God, would there really wasn't a method to do it without suffering?
No, I don't think so.
And
Because
it's
a
like
lot of
okay,
the
like
things that we like doing are bad for us, and we won't stop until it hurts. We won't stop our gambling, we won't stop our drinking, we won't stop our drug taking, and if it's um, widespread in society, we won't stop doing it until it really, really hurts. And sometimes we're so far gone that we can't even wish for the cure. We don't even want to stop. We just think, oh well, I'd rather die than um, give up my addiction or admit I'm wrong. It happens all the time.
yeah. So I mean, from like a correspondence theory of truth for this theological basis, you're gonna have to make unverifiable um postulates like okay, you have a soul that survives death, that good and bad, sin, punishment, and things that let's say you could say truth. They logically, like a coherence view of truth, they might coherently fit into a logical system that makes sense, but they can't be empirically verified.
I'm sorry, what can't be verified?
That was saying like these conditions for this theistic picture that Judaism or Abrahamic religions are pointing are painting like this God that created the world, that is all powerful, all good, all knowing. Um, you puts the soul into the body, is a testing ground. Suffering is a mechanism that enables us to be rewarded or prevent us from going too far off the path. Um, there's no real mechanism to empirically verify it because, like, okay,
No,
like you can't empirically test what happens after death. You
no,
can't
indeed
you
not.
can't
But
you
there are
can't
moral
empirically test.
reasons.
I mean,
There are
you could to
moral
some
reasons
extent
for obeying
empirically
God's
test
laws.
like a rule set. You could say, well, here's a rule set, and here is how well, to some extent, people are obeying the rule set, and here is to some extent reward and punishment, and so you have, but that's also near impossible to empirically test how well a person is obeying the rule set in relationship to reward and punishment. To say like, okay, well, here's a set of rules, and here's people being rewarded and punished, and like the Maimonides, one of the 13 principles is that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. So that's,
In this life or the next.
well, let's just say in this lifetime, because I mean it's pasha in this lifetime, not just like theoretically in the next lifetime also, but just in this lifetime, it's extremely difficult to empirically test whether God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked.
No, no, exactly, because some people do not appear to have received justice in their lifetime, but perhaps later their heroism is recognized, whatever. So we have to assume that uh, God will put right anything that was wrong that the person suffered in their lifetime, and will reward him in heaven. I mean, which is why it is necessary to believe in an afterlife. And the Sadducees didn't, and well, they are now extinct.
Even the principle of the general principle of God rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked doesn't necessitate another lifetime. That the principle of rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked should generally apply within the lifetime, and not. I mean, it also has
It
implications
would be more
for the next
likely to.
lifetime.
Yes, I agree. That the. I mean, we would like the law to work efficiently. If there's a thief, a murderer, the criminals are caught, almost immediately, so that people won't even think that they'll get away with it. But unless our justice system operates in this way, there'll be lots of criminal elements in our society who'll think they'll get away with their lying and cheating and stealing and killing and and corruption. So if we want this system that you've described of swift justice, we ourselves need to obey the laws, or and before that we need to agree on which laws we are supposed to be obeying. And I'm saying it's not that hard because there are only three Abrahamic religions. Yes, I mean there are only three. We don't need to consider Hinduism and Buddhism because it's idolatry. So we we and there's only three. Um, not they're more Jew, they're far more Gentiles than they are Jews. So it can't be Judaism, and Christianity is idolatry, and therefore there's only Islam. I mean, if you want to make things simple for ourselves, there's only five world religions, so we have to choose from one of those. Because it would be silly to create a new religion, because new religion take hundreds of years to establish. So it will have to be an existing religion. Because if you form a new religion, if you found a new religion, it will be treated like a cult, as the early Christians were, and the early Muslims were also persecuted. We don't want that. We just want the authority and protection of an established religion, an established world religion as well. And and it could be argued that America was founded on Islamic principles because of Jefferson's Quran. And the American Revolution was a rejection of Christianity and monarchy. And obviously, Christianity was being rejected by the founding fathers because it was Christianity that supported the divine right of kings. And therefore, the American Republic is really, the key turning point of human history from Christianity to Islam. Though I guess the early Americans didn't recognize it, but I think um, Americans in the 21st century are more likely to do so because they have seen the consequence of not having an official religion.
Okay, I want to read this article about Rabbi Sachs. Do you have anything else you want to say?
No, no. I'll go off now. I think